Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight we're joined by Anne Malik, curator of the Gamble House in Pasadena, California. Contemporary with the Roby House, the building, designed by Green & Green, is one of the finest and most intact architectural examples of the American arts and crafts movement. Prior to joining the Gamble House, Anne worked at the Huntington Library, where she was responsible for cataloging and researching their extensive collection of William Morris material. In 2002, she curated the Huntington's exhibition, William Morris, Creating the Useful and the Beautiful, and also assisted with the 2004 exhibition, The Beauty of Life, William Morris and the Art of Design. In 2008, at the Gamble House, she co-curated the exhibition, A New and Native Beauty, the Art and Craft of Green & Green. A graduate of Oxford University and the Courtauld Institute of Art in the UK, Anne has also worked at two of the great Victorian house museums in London, Leighton House and Linley Sambourne House. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Anne Malik.
Thank you, David and Celeste, and thanks to the Frank Lloyd Wright Preservation Trust for giving me an opportunity to visit your wonderful city and speak to you on this subject whose Englishness is very interesting to me and very dear. So without further ado, in an article for House Beautiful magazine in July 1910, English architect and designer Charles Robert Ashby summarized the relationship between the English arts and crafts movement and its American counterpart. The School of the Middle West and we architects of the arts and crafts movement in England are working to the same goal. We are holding the same stick, only we hold it at opposite ends. The English movement began, or as Alan Crawford has put it, became aware of itself, in the 1880s, largely inspired by the work of William Morris and his decorative arts firm, and by the writings of art critic John Ruskin, several decades before. It was transmitted to America in a variety of forms, through people, through literature, through exhibition, through objects, and through architecture. The original title of my talk, Good Houses and Good Books, reflects the idea that literature and architecture were the major instigators of the movement. They communicated the ideas of the movement and gave it form. These were interpreted differently in different places, as Ashby would observe to Frank Lloyd Wright. Such differences as we may have in the way in which we do our work are due to the fact of our having to do it in different hemispheres. In England, the arts and crafts movement had led Morris to call for social revolution, whereas America in that era, still seeking its own identity, saw the new movement as part of the search. As the two movements merged and evolved, so too did the views of Wright and Ashby on the role of the individual craftsman and incorporation of the machine. I hope to demonstrate today that what began as a dispute between these two men ended in compromise and mutual respect, even a shared nostalgia for the passing of a romantic era into modernity. And the change in the title of my talk, by the way, is not meant as a bait and switch, but rather to indicate a slightly different perspective, which really came about as a result of my research and as I got further into it. And I should just say I owe a particular debt to Ashby biographer Alan Crawford and Ashby scholar Jim Benjamin for their generosity and incredible research into the life of Ashby and his time in America. So Ashby, a Cambridge graduate, teacher, architect, and founder-leader for more than 2 decades of the Guild of Handicraft, was very much at the center of the exchange between England and America in the late 1890s and early decades of the 20th century. He even called himself the successor to William Morris, arriving in America for the first time only 6 months before Morris's death in 1896. He, more than many other figures in the English movement who visited America at this time, Morris's daughter May among them, saw its potential and deliberately sought out members of the movement across the country, visited the social settlements, societies, utopian craft communities, and examined firsthand its art and architecture. He examined it with the eye of a protective parent, keenly concerned with how the movement might change, dissolve, or survive in this newer land that seemed to him so much more ready to embrace technology, and through men like Wright, sought to make it an integral part of its growth and success. I propose to use Ashby's 7 visits to the United States from 1896 to 1938 as a means of broadly tracing the evolution of the arts and crafts movement in this country, and to show how it diverged from the English movement, with Wright helping to lead the way. In their essential idealism, the two movements, English and American, were, quote, at one in our principles, as Ashby would write. They believed in the uplifting power, materially and spiritually, of beauty, and the importance of taking joy in one's labor. Both Wright and Morris had read Ruskin as young men. Ruskin's notion of organic architecture was one that Wright would carry with him throughout his life. Similarly, the college-aged Morris and his friend Edward Burne-Jones committed themselves to a life of art inspired by Ruskin. Ashby's Guild had begun in East London at the university settlement Toynbee Hall, where Ashby began teaching a class on Ruskin in 1886. Much as Morris and his friends were inspired to decorate the interior of the Oxford Union Debating Hall, Ashby's students were so inspired by its subject matter that it led to the painting and decorating of the dining hall and to Ashby's proposal of a school of handicraft a year later. The Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society was founded in London in 1887, and the establishment of the Guild and its workshops would follow in 1888. Ruskin's words found fertile ground across the Atlantic as well, inspiring the young Charles Eliot Norton, future professor and chair of art history at Harvard, to visit him in 1855, beginning a friendship and correspondence that would last for 45 years. Henry Hobson Richardson, perhaps the first major American architect of the 19th century to develop a uniquely American architecture, visited Morris at Merton Abbey in 1882, having recently completed Trinity Church in Boston with its specially commissioned Morris & Company stained glass windows. That same year, poet and playwright Oscar Wilde visited America, lecturing on the decorative arts and the house beautiful, and championing ideas of the arts and crafts movement. Quote, "I find what your people need is not so much high imaginative art, but that which hallows the vessels of everyday use." Ensuing years and decades would see many Atlantic crossings. From England, the illustrator and designer Walter Crane, typographer and printer T.J. Cobden Sanderson, Ashby, and English transplants to the US, which included architect H. Langford Warren, with whom Charles Green would later work, and Joseph Twyman, furniture designer and founder of the William Morris Society in Chicago. There were many more crossings from the American side, from Norton and Richardson to Hull House founders Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, Gustav Stickley, Elbert Hubbard, John Lafarge, Ernest Batchelder, Charles Green, and Jack London. In nearly every case, the Americans returned invigorated by new ideas, eager to establish societies and periodicals to share them with others, social settlements for educating the immigrant and working class, craft communities to produce beautiful things in more hospitable, creative environments, and businesses that would make the simple, well-crafted object available to a wider audience. Examples of these enterprises were wide-ranging and were as widely established across the country, from east to west coasts. The first Arts and Crafts Society was in fact established in Minneapolis in 1895, though Chicago ultimately laid claim to the largest number of groups inspired by Morris and Ruskin's examples. Exhibitions of arts and crafts at Copley Hall in Boston and by Hull House in Chicago in the spring of 1897 led to the founding of arts and crafts societies in both cities later that year. The then newly founded House Beautiful magazine remarked on the odd coincidence of the Chicago Society springing from Hull House in almost the same way that Ashby's School and Guild had emerged from Toynbee Hall, though perhaps not such a coincidence given that Addams had visited Toynbee Hall in 1887 before founding Hull House in 1889. George Twose, an Englishman, was the first president of the Chicago Society, having taught manual training in the city's public schools and working classes at Hull House. One of the purposes of these mini societies was to offer exhibitions for exposure of local craft while also showing them in relation to international examples. The 1897 Boston exhibit had included the work of major English figures including Morris, Crane, the architect C.F.A. Voisey, and Ashby, although Morris and Company had come to the city even earlier as part of the 1883 Boston Foreign Fair. The international expositions that had begun with London's Great Exhibition of 1851 were an additional forum for new work in architecture and the decorative arts, even if they were set against industrially manufactured products. Voisey's work was included in Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893, and London's Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society was given space at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904. The exchange of ideas between England and America also found form in a number of individual and collective craft shops and communities established primarily, but not exclusively, in the East and Midwest. While more independent shops like that of Arthur and Lucia Matthews or Dirk van Erp found it more expedient to situate themselves in city environments like San Francisco, many communities like Ralph Whitehead's Birdcliff, Hubbard's Roycrofters, and Will Price's Rose Valley sought the refuge of the countryside, a choice as much to do with finding inspiration for their craft in nature as it was about living the ideal of a better, simpler life. This is a choice that Ashby and his guild would make as well, and they were followed closely in Rose Valley's Artsman magazine. The challenge for all was to find an economically viable means of getting the product to the consumer and to earn a living by their craft. None except Roycroft survived as a business enterprise much beyond the first few years, and the Roycrofters saw their community decline as well after Hubbard's death in 1915. The oft-repeated lament of these craftsmen was the need to educate the consumer to appreciate, not to mention pay for, the handcrafted object. There were two ends to this stick too. Paying customers sometimes discovered that handcrafted was not necessarily synonymous with well-made. While craft communities sought to marry life and craft, and public exhibitions made the products of the new movement available for wider consumption and comparison, they were made even more accessible through the periodicals and publications of the time. Only a small group of intellectuals and craftsmen, after all, could afford to travel overseas to the source, but they could write about their experiences as critics could describe the exhibitions, along with photographs of the objects displayed or sketches and plans of the new architecture. Charles Holm, editor of London Studio magazine, even lent photographs of English and French work to a 1908 exhibit of arts and crafts work at the National Arts Club in New York, an exhibit which was then reviewed in Stickley's Craftsman magazine. The press then was really at the heart of this exchange, with the circulation of monthly periodicals jumping from 18 to 64 million subscribers per issue between 1890 and 1905. This was made possible largely by improvements in technology. The rotary press and the process of photo engraving helped both to facilitate larger runs and lower the cost of artwork. English and American practitioners alike took advantage of this by either establishing their own magazines or writing for design and shelter magazines with larger circulations. Albert Hubbard, who had made the pilgrimage to England in 1894 to try to see Morris, he claimed he saw him, but no one can substantiate that. With his magazine, The Philistine, reached 126,000 subscribers by 1906. The Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston had founded its publication Handicraft in 1902, which would publish many articles on English work, including Ashby's Guild. Gustav Stickley, furniture maker, having established his own business in 1898, began producing the Craftsman magazine in 1901, which became a vehicle much like Hubbard's Philistine for aligning himself with the English movement, as well as for marketing his own products conveniently. The first issues would also be dedicated to William Morris. The American arm of the English Studio magazine appeared in 1897 and published a great deal of English and continental work for American consumption, including from its earliest issues the work of Ashby, as well as English arts and crafts figures like Voysey, M.H. Bailey Scott, and Charles Rennie Mackintosh. But of the many periodicals, perhaps the greatest levelers were The House Beautiful and the Ladies' Home Journal. Both magazines were aimed at a mostly middle-class audience and dedicated to promoting an idealized view of American democracy as best embodied in the American home. Indeed, they distinguished between the English and American arts and crafts movement, House Beautiful cautioning, "It is well not to make too much a fetish of Morris, not to follow blindly." Established in 1897, House Beautiful claimed to represent, quote, "simplicity, economy, and appropriateness in the home." The Ladies' Home Journal was established in 1883, but by 1889 had become the best-selling magazine in the nation, so no small thanks to its editor, Edward Bach. Wright, whose work was represented in early issues of House Beautiful, the first magazine to publish his work, in fact, as well as in the seminal Model Home series begun by Ladies' Home Journal in 1895, would extol the possibilities of the press as representative of the new machine in his 1901 lecture, The Art and Craft of the Machine. Quote, "The wide white band streams into the marvel of the multiple press, receiving unerringly the indelible impression of the human hopes, joys, and fears throbbing in the pulse of this great activity, as infallibly as the gray matter of the human brain receives the impression of the senses, to come forth millions of neatly folded, perfected new sheets, teeming with vivid appeals to passions, good and evil, the doings of all the world reflected as in a glass." Now, was it just coincidence that Wright delivered this talk at Hull House only a month after his design for A Home in a Prairie Town appeared in the Ladies' Home Journal? With a second design, in fact, appearing that July. He was one of the first architects to take up Bach's offer to submit these speculative plans, which could then be purchased from the magazine for $5. This, of course, when architects were charging about $50 to $100 for a similar product. The journal continued to run the series for nearly 2 decades afterwards, with architect Stanford White declaring in 1906 that Edward Bach had more completely influenced American domestic architecture for the better than any man in his generation. Ashby entered into the very beginning of all of this activity and promise in 1896 with a mixture of condescension and idealism. He had read Whitman and the Transcendentalist, but thought Americans still needed reminding of the importance of leisure and repose. Quote, "One feels as if one wanted to lay the compelling hand of friendship upon these people, bid them go out into the woods for a while." He arrived in March with the Guild an established success in its newer premises at Essex House. Wright was well established by this time, of course, having left Sullivan's office in 1893 and having then extended his house and studio. He was also beginning to take advantage of showing his work in the annual exhibitions at the Chicago Architectural Club. This was the year, of course, too, of Morris's great press achievement, the Kelmscott Chaucer. And as if in commemoration, Wright and former client William Winslow began work on a private press edition of the essay of a Unitarian minister, William Gannett, entitled The House Beautiful. It would take nearly 2 years to complete, but its layouts, the arrangement of margins, and decorations echoed Morris's own designs. The essay itself espoused many of the ideas shared by the arts and crafts movement that, quote, "the ideals of beauty are found in simple, restful things." In Gannett's thinking, good construction and good books shared an equally important role in contributing to the right environment and right living. Morris, too, had believed that good houses and good books were the pleasurable end towards which all societies of human beings ought now to struggle. Wright, as if further interpreting this idea, proclaimed in a lecture to Evanston's University Guild in 1896, quote, "These homes will be biographies and poems instead of slanders and poetry crushers, appealing to the center of the human soul through perceptive faculties as potent as those that made the book. The family, the client, the idea, these were almost more important than the building itself." The book, The House Beautiful, and Wright's house designs up to this point were largely the product of partnerships and the belief in the central importance of the home and family. In 1893, he had left the fraternal atmosphere of Sullivan's office, settling in Steinway Hall a few years later, where he would share offices with other young architects who together would foster the new, quote, "School of the Middle West." They were founder members together of the Chicago Arts and Crafts Society and believed it was incumbent upon them to create a new and native architecture. Wright had a great deal in common with Morris and Ashby at this time, though he may not have been as willing to admit to the similarity. They had all three of them begun their work inspired by art and fraternity. Morris and Ashby, too, had begun their careers in architecture, that unifier of the arts, and with a brotherhood of fellow artists, Ashby with his school and guild, and Morris first with the decoration of the Oxford Union, then the collaborative design and furnishing of his own home. Red House has often been called the first example of arts and crafts architecture. Rossetti described it as, quote, "more a poem than a house." It was attempting both something new and intensely personal, a simple structure built with respect for its materials. In Pioneers of Modern Design, Pevsner wrote, "Red House as a whole is a building of surprisingly independent character, solid and spacious looking, and yet not in the least pretentious. He shows the red bricks of the facade without covering it with plaster, as neoclassical rules prescribed, and takes the outside appearance of the house as an expression of inside requirements without attempting a grand and useless symmetry." Like Wright's home in Oak Park, it was built in a slightly rural suburb. Both men had chosen their sites for their picturesque qualities, Morris for the native orchards, and Wright for the plantings left by the Scottish landscape gardener, eventually even incorporating the existing willow tree into his expanding plan. Their families were begun in these first homes, their businesses born out of them, Wright's eventually housed in the expansion. Indeed, this was to have been the case with Red House as well, for there had been plans to extend the L-shaped plan into a U, providing houses and workspace both for Morris and the Burne-Jones families. At Red House, designed by architect Philip Webb, with help from his friend Morris, there is a flow between living spaces with a real sense of human scale. Even the decoration of interiors is in a similar spirit, the symbolism of objects and motifs, and the whimsical nature of paintings like those in Wright's playroom or on the walls and furniture of Red House. Indeed, if Webb and Wright could have sat down to discuss these two houses, if we could be flies on the wall, they would have agreed that architecture should be organic, that one should remain independent of the crowd. Webb never published his work and rarely took apprentices. There's only one known photograph of him, in fact. Wright would ultimately go on to have many more clients and produce more houses, but there was certainly common ground between these architects. In both houses, perhaps most importantly, is represented the sacredness of home life, something at the heart of Gannett's essay and the arts and crafts movement with its centralizing of the family hearth. It was these common currents and concerns that drew together Ashby and Wright on Ashby's second visit to the United States in the fall of 1900. Ashby's first visit had been supported by and was in support of the American Society for the Extension of University Teaching. In the intervening 4 years, his work had found new outlets in the United States. An article on the Guild had appeared in an early issue of the International Studio in 1897, giving its history and its goal of cooperation and industrial partnership. And although its author forswore offering commentary on its products, one imagines Ashby being particularly gratified by its conclusion that, quote, the quality of human relationship and the effort of the guildsmen to create a method of life that shall be not merely commercial gives to many of the articles turned out at Essex House the individual character to be found in them. Nevertheless, it was the objects of the Guild that were exhibited across the East and Midwest from New York to St. Louis in the late 1890s, if not in person, then in photographs and drawings. Ashby, according to the studio's evaluation, was still working along Ruskinian lines, and so was Wright. In an 1898 lecture, Art in the Home, he urged his audience to, quote, go to nature, consider her ways. Let your home appear to grow easily from its site and shape it to sympathize with its surroundings. Stickley had visited England in that year, returning to begin work on his new Craftsman furniture line, and Hubbard had made further headway with his Roycroft campus in East Aurora, completing his print shop in January and continuing to buy more real estate and plan for additional buildings for the crafts that would come to be manufactured there. Janet Ashby, Ashby's wife, who visited the States with her husband in 1900, had visited the Roycroft campus without him, approving of the style, if not necessarily the final product, quote, at present, they go on the do it as well as you can principle, which is very human, but they turn out a lot of poor work. It was not only craft, but quality that was wanted. The poor work only diminished the notion of handicraft. But recall again that this was an English perspective and one that Ashby would eventually amend, and perhaps Janet too. Ashby's second trip was as a spokesman and fundraiser for the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. He stayed for 4 months this time, traveling to 14 states and speaking to over 50 audiences. By both publications and exhibitions, he was now better known. In his travels, he could sense the growth of the movement in the years since his previous visit, and he sought out the leaders of the American movement, enlisting new members for the Trust from among its ranks, from Ellen Gates Starr, John Dewey, Wright, Norton, among others. Ashby visited Chicago for the first time and noted its higher regard for art over the merely commercial. He wrote that it was, quote, the only American city I have seen where something absolutely distinctive in the aesthetic handling of material has been evolved out of the industrial system. There was a sense here that industry could act not only as a blight to art, but also held a glimmer of hope, if carefully controlled, that is. Oscar Lavelle Triggs, professor at the University of Chicago, had helped to found the Industrial Art League the previous year, its goal to help guide the use of the machine to end human drudgery. And the machine was the subject of Ashby and Wright's conversation at their first meeting over dinner at Hull House one evening. Ashby wrote, quote, he threw down the glove to me in characteristic Chicagoan manner in the matter of arts and crafts and the creations of the machine. My God, said he, is machinery, and the art of the future will be the expression of the individual artist through the 1,000 powers of the machine doing all that the individual workman cannot do, and the creative artist is the man that controls all this and understands it. Ashby came away concerned about, quote, the individuality of the average, not just of the artist. He could appreciate the new style that was emerging from such thought, having been taken through the Joseph Husser House by Wright, which he wrote was, quote, one of the most beautiful and the most individual of creations I have seen in America. Both men were working toward a better art for a better society, but not necessarily by the same social means. It is telling that Ashby returned to Britain in 1901 to write an endeavor toward the teaching of John Ruskin and William Morris, going back to his roots. Published by the Essex House Press, it described the, quote, conviction that machinery must be relegated to its proper place as the tool and not the master of the workman, that the life of the producer is to the community a more vital consideration than the cheap production which ignores it, and that thus the human and ethical considerations that insist on the individuality of the workman are of the first importance. Ashby was inching closer to Wright's respect for the machine, while at the same time defending Ruskin's belief in the supremacy of the individual craftsman. Wright would in turn give his now famous lecture, The Art and Craft of the Machine, only 2 months after Ashby's departure and on the very site of their first argument. While he respected the words of Morris and Ruskin, he sought to reformulate them for a new age. The new work was once again a protest, but it was not art and craft against industry. It was new tools and processes against tradition and historic precedent. As young as America was, traditions were bound to be those of other cultures, and the call was for indigenous and inventive, as Elmer Gray had written in Inland Architect in 1900. Indeed, 1901 was a momentous year for both Wright and Ashby. Wright was continuing to flesh out a new architectural idiom from the appearance of the more traditional a home in a prairie town and a small house with lots of room in it that February and July in the Ladies' Home Journal, to the revolutionary design of the Ward Willets House in Highland Park. With the iconic hearth at its center and rooms flowing away from and around it, the Willets House was innovative and yet well integrated with its environment, the roof lines peeking out from amongst the trees. Ashby would have approved. Wright had given a lecture the previous year concerning landscape architecture, in which he recommended the use of indigenous plant materials, that landscape and architecture should be considered together. Morris, too, had believed that the garden should be integral to the design of the house, that it should, in fact, look like part of the house. His words were also inspiration for English arts and crafts landscape designer Gertrude Jekyll, whom Wright referenced in his talk, and whose book Home and Garden had been published in 1900. Jekyll had begun a prolific partnership with country house architect Edwin Lutyens in that other momentous year of 1896. She believed that, quote, what he builds seems to grow naturally out of the ground, and as testament commissioned Lutyens to design her own house, Munstead Wood, in Surrey. The ensuing decade would see the full flowering of what came to be known, as you know, the prairie style, embodied earliest in Wright's work and which continued to explore the Ruskinian idea of organic architecture. As Jekyll had written of Lutyens, so too did Wright's architecture appear to grow naturally from the ground. The use of autumnal tonalities inside and out, the bands of casement windows providing wider views, the sheltering protective roofs with their deep eaves that also drew the house closer to the earth, the incorporation of plant material along walls and terraces to soften the hard masonry, the extension of the house into nature through the use of pergolas, terraces, and balconies. Ashby would not return to the States until 1908, and in that time, Wright would execute some 90 commissions, including the Dana, Coonley, and Roby houses, and more publicly in the starkly concrete but surprisingly light and spacious Unity Church and Larkin Building. His work, like Ashby's, was becoming more widely exhibited and published in House Beautiful, the Ladies' Home Journal, Architectural Record, and others, all keen to identify him as signifier of a new American style. Ashby had written a journal entry in 1900, quote, Wright is to my thinking far and away the ablest man in our line of work that I have come across in Chicago, perhaps in America. The upswell in Wright's commissions and notoriety was coincident with the general rise of the movement in the United States. New publications like American Homes and Gardens, House and Garden, the Boston Society's Handicraft, and Rose Valley's Artsman all contributed to promotion of the movement. Stickley had debuted his new furniture line in 1900 at the Toby Furniture Company in Chicago, and 1902 would see the publication of Oscar Lavelle Trigg's Chapters in the History of the Arts and Crafts Movement. Its chapters were devoted to Ruskin, Morris, and Ashby, a roster that once again singled out Ashby as a successor to the other men's visions, their visions of joy and labor and the beautiful and useful object. Triggs identified the Guild of Handicraft as, quote, another milestone on the road to industrial freedom. Ashby had returned from the States in 1901, inspired perhaps by the energy and momentum he had felt in Chicago and fired by discussions with Wright to take the Guild to the countryside. to prove that one could successfully merge the art of life with the art of work. Later that year, Ashby would send 150 men, women, and children from East London, where their urban-based craft enterprise, to the Cotswold market town of Chipping Campden. Morris may have once felt that Ashby's tool was too small to do much good, but Ashby believed the way to social revolution lay within the small workshop, and this was to be its true testing ground. Unfortunately, and perhaps predictably, by 1908, the Guild had gone into voluntary liquidation. And as Ashby would write a year later, the table was in the process of being set afresh. There had been an idyllic interlude which had drawn the interest of the American public, from articles like, quote, a successful English experiment in Handicraft magazine, to the many American visitors to the Guild at Camden. Jack London came that same year to do research for his book, People of the Abyss. Metalwork craftsman Darcy Gaw visited, as did tilemaker Ernest Batchelder and architect H. Langford Warren. But fissures were appearing. Warren criticized, quote, it is all handwork to what seemed to me an unnecessary and even unwise degree. A 1904 article in House and Garden was equally skeptical of the Guild's displays at the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in London. Quote, there is practically nothing made for or by the working classes. There is work carried out by working men in plenty. All kinds of it come, for instance, from the Guild of Handicrafts. But the god behind the machine is C.R. Ashby, and it is safe to say that without the years he has devoted to helping, teaching, and inspiring working men, few of those exhibits would be there. The influence, valuable though it may be, comes from above and not below. Batchelder, too, would echo this sentiment in a 1909 article in The Craftsman, quote, cooperation that does not cooperate breeds discontent among those who are cooperated upon. Other American reviews of the arts and crafts movement, as with Trigg's book of 1902, continually sought to portray the associations with the early English movement, legitimizing its beginnings in heroic figures like Morris, Ruskin, and even Ashby, yet also laying claim to its own version of it. As Batchelder also wrote in 1909, quote, machinery is not in itself an evil, we need more of it. The Americans may also have seen an opportunity in what were possibly the waning years of arts and crafts in England. Ashby appeared to be reflecting on this when he returned to the States in October 1908, remaining this time for 5 months, traveling across the entire country during that time from Massachusetts to California. He had brought the Guild through liquidation and sought to defend, quote, the continuity of the working idea. Through private support in the small holdings enterprise, he had been able to preserve some of the working premise of the Guild, and as at the time he was focused on preserving and restoring local architecture. With Ashby, there was always a foot in the past, and yet coming to America, he was confronted with its potential to face with greater success what he described as, quote, the coming change. He recognized this potential in both Will Price and in Wright, though cautioning, quote, it is a fine trait, this impatience of the past, but only when it has genius or taste as a guide. He had complimented the Rose Valley enterprise as a sensible and human bohemia after visiting in 1908, but whether due to taste or commercial competition, it would be dissolved only 2 years later. In visiting the West Coast, and you know I had to show a slide of the Gamble House, and spending time with architect Charles Green in Pasadena, seeing the workshops of the Swedish-born Hall brothers where the Green's furniture designs were being produced, Ashby instinctively identified with the quality of the work and the aims of this more collaborative enterprise, which celebrated handwork over the machine while incorporating the machine as necessary. He would note in his journal, quote, the arts and crafts, what all the others are screaming and hustling about, are here actually being produced. He went on to say that this work had, quote, more tenderness, more subtlety, and more self-effacement than is in Wright's work, and it is more refined and has more repose. It may have been that visiting Pasadena, feeling closer to nature than to industry along the picturesque Arroyo Seco, Ashby saw the, quote, healthy life and saner culture that he missed in the East or the Midwest, and that he believed he was still trying to work towards in Camden. A series of articles appearing in House Beautiful in 1909 and 1910, and the foreword he wrote for the second smaller edition of photographs of Wright's work published in Berlin by Ernst Wasmuth in 1911, show Ashby working through these ideas. Wright had broken with his family and to some extent his practice when he went to Europe in 1909. I won't go into that story. He wrote to Ashby from Fiesole in July 1910, quote, I am cast by nature for the part of the iconoclast. I must strike or tear down before I can build. Ashby may have been recognizing this in his foreword when he defined American individualism, the national condition, as that in which, quote, the individual pursues his own ends or follows his own ideas. He saw Wright as representative of the new spirit in architecture that would help resolve the, quote, problem of our civilization and determine the future of all of the arts. Quoting Wright's own words from his 1908 lecture in The Cause of Architecture, Ashby noted that the proposed solution to this problem was that normal tool of civilization, the machine. While Ashby could approve of Wright's spirit and admire the monumental character and distinctively American quality of Unity Church, the plan and form of his buildings, he missed the, quote, living and tender detail that was necessarily limited or excluded by the use of the machine. He nevertheless sought common ground between Wright and the arts and craftsmen of England, and he went through the entire roster practically in his introduction. But he says, we guard in common the lamp of truth, referencing Ruskin's 7 Lamps of Architecture. In the series of articles for House Beautiful entitled Man and the Machine, Ashby again singled out Unity Church as an example of, quote, the very principles for which the English arts and crafts movement stands in the truthfulness of its structure, with all detail excluded that was not of, quote, genuine human expression. Wright had broken away again from family and convention following his return from Europe in 1910. Perhaps inspired by what he had seen of Ashby's work in Camden, he created his own fellowship at Taliesin, establishing a new life and legacy, quote, a recreation ground for my children and their children, perhaps for many generations more. As Ashby had sought out Camden and Morris Kelmscott Manor, Wright was now also seeking the countryside, setting his new home and studio well into and of the Wisconsin hillside where it was built. Indeed, Ashby's aforementioned critique of Wright in the Wasmuth publication was reprinted nearly in full in a 1913 article in Western Architect on, quote, Taliesin, the home of Frank Lloyd Wright, and a study of the owner, as if to sanction the new project, almost indicating a handing off of the baton, or perhaps the stick. Indeed, Ashby seemed to realize that it was the Wrightian iconoclasm and its embrace of the machine, complete with its limitations, that would carry the movement forward in America. He returned to the States during the war for 3 periods during 1915 and 16. It was very much a time of beginnings and endings on both sides of the Atlantic. Joseph Fels, who had supported the small holdings scheme in chipping Camden, had died in 1914, and between this and the war, it felt like the Guild experiment had finally found a hurdle it could not surmount, despite Ashby's greatest hopes. 1914 was also an annus horribilis for Wright, of course, with fire and tragedy at Taliesin. In March 1915, Stickley's workshops would declare bankruptcy, and Hubbard would go down with the Lusitania on May 7th. In August 1915, the craftsman would report, quote, Mr. Ashby's workshops are all closed. 3 of his workers are at the front. A 4th is drilling cavalry. Another is learning to drop bombs from an aeroplane. And another, quote, the best enameler in England, is making cartridges. That magazine, too, would cease publication later the following year. Ashby visited what remained of Ralph Whitehead's Birdcliff, the Englishman's utopian craft experiment in the American countryside, blaming its demise on, quote, machine competition and dilettantism, not quite recognizing what it might have had in common with the end of his own guild. In the magazine Art in Progress later that year, perhaps thinking in part or only in part of Wright, he advocated that hope lay in, quote, the man who wants to lead a clean life, wants to invent but has no business gift, but knows somehow where the joy of life lies. In short, the democracy. England may stand for quality, but America may yet have the last word. There is real tension in Ashby's writing about America at this time. In Art in Progress, he still condemned the city as the center of great mechanical production, with craft only capable of surviving in the country. While he had witnessed its failure at Birdcliff, he found cause for renewed hope in the school and craft community of Alverhoy near Milton, New York, a reflection of the Guild venture in Danish-American guise. But in 1917, Ashby would publish Where the Great City Stands, a study in new civics, its title drawn from the work of Walt Whitman. In it, he would applaud America's City Beautiful movement, the utopian potential of progressive reforms, with the city at the center of all as the focus of democratic idealism. He had begun to work out many of these ideas during his 3rd lecture tour and subsequent articles in House Beautiful. In the chapter entitled The Progress of Architecture and Where the Great City Stands, he noted that the English and Americans were, quote, each in their way touched by the new spirit. In the American work, the artist arrives at his result by unloading all ornament except that which he can, through the machine, directly control. In the English work, he does it by collaboration with working craftsmen whose guiding principle is freedom from the machine incubus. The result to architecture is the same. The art becomes alive. Here, Ashby has resolved differences from that first argument at Hull House, in which he and Wright held opposing ends of the same stick. Machinery is finally admitted to be not the thing that deadens, but that can bring to life. By collaboration of working craftsmen, Ashby could well have been thinking of Rodmarten Manor in Gloucestershire, considered the last great work of arts and crafts architecture, and which I show here in comparison with Wright's work of the time, at the time that Rodmarten was completed in 1929, just to show that juxtaposition. And it was completed, Rodmarten was completed entirely with local material and by local craftsmen. On visiting it in 1914, Ashby, already with a touch of nostalgia, had remarked, quote, "I've seen no modern work equal to it. It is a house built on the basis not of contract, but of confidence. The English arts and crafts movement at its best is here." And he might have said at its last. He may also have been thinking of Wright's Taliesin, which he had seen in early 1916 on a visit to Spring Green. And he describes it: "It is on the brow of a hill overhanging valley and streams, a sort of Cotswold hill country. One can't help admiring the daring and grandeur and imagination of the man." Ashby would always seek to preserve and at least remind the world, as he did Wright, of the craftsman ideal. He visited 3 more times in his life, in 1923, 1931, and 1938, the last to visit his daughter, who had married an American astronomer and was living in Chicago. Wright and Ashby continued an intermittent correspondence, with Wright sending him a copy of the Taliesin prospectus and naming him a friend of the fellowship, and writing to him, "High regard for you and your own work along similar constructive lines makes you a friend from whom we solicit continued support and interest in any way you feel free to give it," as well as mailing him a copy of his autobiography in 1934. In response to the latter, Ashby finally settled their differences as he had those between Charles Green and Wright in 1909. Quote, "On all matters of vital principles, you and I are at one. Indeed, I think we always have been. Such differences as we may have in the way in which we do our work are due to the fact of our having to do it in different hemispheres." He even supposed that Wright might no longer believe in the use of the machine as absolute, and this was to some extent true. On his visit to England in 1939 to deliver a series of lectures at the Royal Institute of British Architects, Wright admitted, quote, "I said that the only way man can use his machine and keep alive what is best of him is to go by means of it to the larger freedom the machine makes possible. Go towards decentralization instead of continuing the centralization of the machine that the machine exploits, and so far as any great human benefit goes, will explode." Wright, in his way, was finally looking at what was best for the worker. He does not say artist, but man. And it was always the life and work of the man that concerned first Ruskin, then Morris, then Ashby. In Ashby's letter to Wright about his autobiography, he wrote, quote, "An Englishman of the arts and crafts movement may be forgiven too for suggesting that many of the points you make, very wisely of the Middle West, were made years ago by Pugin, Ruskin, Morris. We are all of us the children of the Romantic movement, which meant the revival of the Gothic spirit." In later years, Wright appeared to look more kindly on the English arts and crafts. In a review of the memorial volumes of Letchian's work in 1951, he wrote sympathetically of the, quote, "love, loyalty, and art with which this cultured architect in love with architecture shaped his buildings." On that 1939 visit to London, he had met Letchians and Voysey, in fact, Ashby's old comrades. Quote, "Loved them both," he wrote. Ashby had invited him to dine at the Art Workers Guild, the organization that had given birth to the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1887, and of which Morris, Voysey, Letchins, and Ashby had all served as past masters. Wright declined, claiming lecture fatigue and the need to get away. He had seen Ashby briefly, and it would be the last time. Janet Ashby would write to Wright in 1950 after hearing him speak on the radio, relating the news of her husband's death in 1942. Quote, "I hear your voice as dynamic as ever," she wrote. And it was. Nearly 50 years after his work had appeared in its first issues, Frank Lloyd Wright was again being published in the pages of House Beautiful magazine, its then editor Elizabeth Gordon calling him, quote, "the most influential design source of the last 50 years. The arts and crafts had ceded place to the modern, and Wright would carry it forward. He and Ashby had held opposing ends of that stick for 4 decades. till at last it seemed their grasps might touch. Thank you.